Hi, everyone. Good morning and good evening, wherever you are. Welcome to today's online event. This is Jill from USC. The USC graduate program events are a series of webinars devoting to spread ideas. Cutting-edge knowledge and insights from different industries and areas will be presented here by world-leading renowned speakers of USC. Today's topic is Toward Sustainability, USC Regulatory and Quality Sciences Information Session from the USC Mann School of Pharmacy and Pharmaceutical Sciences. Please welcome our two guest speakers, Dr. Anju Pacifici, Chair, Associate Professor, Department of Regulatory and Quality Sciences, Dr. Terry David Church, Assistant Professor of Regulatory and Quality Sciences, Department of Regulatory and Quality Sciences. Welcome. Please note that there will be a Q&A session at the end, so feel free to leave your questions down below in the chat box. We will try to go over as many as we can. Please note this webinar will be recorded for future use, and please mute yourself during the presentation for a good quality event. Without further ado, let's get started. Please welcome Dr. Pacifici and Dr. Church.
Thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. You're going to see a blank desktop, and then you'll see my slides come up very shortly. Okay, does everything look okay?
Looks great.
Very good. All right, we're getting to be such pros at navigating Zoom. So hello, everyone. It is great to be collaborating again with our colleagues in the USC China office for this seminar series. Today, we will focus our attention on the concept of sustainability from a regulatory perspective. I am again joined by my fellow faculty in our department, Dr. Terry Church. And this is kind of a continuation of a conversation that we started last year, and we would like to expand further. So I have a few slides in the beginning, and then I will be turning it over to Dr. Church. Okay. We have a number of topics we want to cover in kind of these general categories. We want to, kind of explore how, changes in how new therapeutic products are developed for a global population. So we've heard of the term globalization for many years now, and you can see it in different areas, but in the biomedical field, when a company develops a biologic or a drug or medical device, the company develops it for the global patient population. And so these endeavors become truly global and grandiose. And so we will talk a little bit about the idea of regulatory convergence and regulatory harmonization. We also look at sustainability in terms of decentralization of global clinical trials, the use of technology like artificial intelligence for product development, mobile health, remote data capture, how these types of technology can actually enhance sustainability. When we talk about convergence and harmonization, we are really talking about reducing the duplication of efforts, and Dr. Church would expand upon that topic further. The idea of reusing data from one jurisdiction for another to get the product approval in another jurisdiction, that also speaks to the reduction of duplication of efforts. And then now more than ever, we are really cognizant about including historically underrepresented population in the clinical trial process. So the idea of clinical trial diversity is something that we've been talking about for a few years. And in our group, we have been actually researching that topic as well with our student researchers. And we have some new regulatory requirements, on the topic of clinical trial diversity. So Dr. Church will talk about that as well. When we talk about how new therapeutics are developed for a global population, the goal is to develop products that could help patients all over the world so that we can provide treatments and lower the suffering of patients who have unmet medical needs. But there are challenges in providing global access. We want to focus today on patients who receive the therapeutics, professionals who work to develop and commercialize them, and the changing landscape for conducting the work that's necessary to deliver these products all over the world. So when we talk about globalization and when we talk about all over the world, what are we really talking about? We are really talking about 195 countries. And, we talk about United States and the US FDA, but United States is just one of 195 countries around the world. And US FDA really has jurisdiction only within the borders of United States. All the other countries have their own health authorities or regulatory agencies. Now, some regulatory agencies are quite advanced, like the US FDA or the Health Canada in Canada, the European Medicines Agency for the European Union, the PMDA in Japan, MFDS in South Korea, and of course the NMPA in China. Those are more sophisticated and emerging economies with rather advanced regulatory bodies. But there are many countries where the regulatory bodies really are not well resourced. And so if there is challenge when you have a product that a company in the United States or Europe or Japan is trying to develop and deliver for patients all over the world. So if all 195 countries are going to review a product all on their own, imagine the duplication of effort, imagine the amount of resource and the time commitment that would be involved. So, that if you really think about it, that process is not really sustainable. The idea of having to navigate across all the different agencies, and we have just a handful here. So imagine having 195 regulatory agencies and a company having to navigate through the regulatory maze across the globe. The global regulatory strategy becomes critical to the success of the product development and the ability to provide access to innovative products for patients all over the world. So because these products are so highly regulated, the regulatory strategy drives the product strategy that in turn drives the business strategy. So the regulatory strategy, in essence, becomes a key driver for the biomedical industry. And those companies who can do this well can become successful. By coming to agreement on common standards and processes we can actually minimize redundancies and thereby reduce time, resources, and effort to bring new therapeutics to patients around the globe. We are also seeing changes in how products are developed. So now I will turn the presentation over to Dr. Terry Church, who will continue the conversation in line with the sustainability in product development and commercialization in this era of globalization. Dr. Church.
Thank
I'm
you.
going to stop sharing my.
Excellent. So just as you're talking today, I just finished doing a review article, reviewing it for a journal that is looking at the way the African Medical Association is building and creating its own regulatory environment. And the interesting thing with that is their environment has been harmonized during COVID. So they've been doing a lot of what we will be talking about tonight as they prepare to create a harmonized program for regulatory, which is very exciting. So with that, let's get started. So thank you all for having us, by the way. I'm Dr. Terry Church, and it's wonderful to be here today to talk to you about this issue. As you can tell, we're very passionate about this area, especially as it relates to sustainability. For those of you who are wondering, what is sustainability or how does it impact in this field? Sustainability can mean reduced costs over time. It can mean optimizing supply chains and making sure that you have access to different materials. It can mean relying on technology to assist with the maintenance and ongoing processes that are involved in clinical trials. It can also help with things like getting meetings organized, paperwork, and even authentication of specific documents in a way that is meaningful and acceptable by a lot of the regulatory bodies. It's also reducing effort, as Dr. Pacifici mentioned. This is a crucial aspect of what we can do with sustainability. And it helps us to harness work done previously or in tandem to optimize our workflows, just to make sure that we're not continuing to do the same thing over and over again. And what we see is that this is the time of a great climate change in clinical trials. A lot has happened and a lot has been forced to happen due to COVID. But some of those things that we've learned along the way will help us build a better and more sustainable environment for the future. As many of you may know, clinical trials are not cheap. They are very expensive to get up and going. And this is just a snapshot look at what a clinical trial costs at phase 3. Most clinical trials from start to end will cost just about 2.6 billion US dollars to get them up and going, which on average, if you do it by patient for a phase 3 trial, that's about $36,500. It's a pretty expensive price tag. As you can see in this chart, these are the areas that we are most in development with in the US. As you can see, pain and anesthesia kind of are leading the race, followed by ophthalmology. And it may surprise you to know that oncology is pretty far down. Oftentimes when we think of new drug discovery, we're oftentimes thinking about oncology, but they're kind of a little further into the cost by association. Where do those costs come from? Well, they come from a variety of places, but the majority tend to be things around clinical procedures, things that are happening within hospitals or in the clinic. Staff and admin definitely have a portion of that cost. Site monitoring, physically going to the site and doing your ongoing monitoring of the data, as well as the study protocol and other documents. Retention, patient recruitment, they take up a fair amount, but not equal in terms of the site monitoring, clinical procedures, and other associated costs that we can start to shrink that bill down a little bit by using sustainable methods. Just as another way of giving you a look at what various phases of clinical trials cost, this is a brief breakdown of them by phase, just to give you an overview of what our biggest expenses are. And as you can see, a lot of it is still that monitoring cost, as well as overhead costs that we can start to shrink and hopefully apply that money in better ways to more trials or even better conducted trials. Part of what we saw during COVID was a move towards decentralized clinical trials. And this is something that had begun well before COVID, but really did not get get its full wings or its feet, as they say, until the pandemic struck. Decentralized trials really help navigate a whole new world of electronic data. Everything that you can imagine, starting with patient recruitment, telemedicine visits or virtual visits, wearables that people can send data into their study, even transportation can all be taken care of through this decentralized model. It gives us a way to kind of really keep the patient engaged, as well as keep the collection of data moving forward without having the expense or the worry of bringing a patient in, sometimes from a very far distance away, to the clinical site to get data collected. Here's just another model of what that looks like. So as you can see, again, the patient is in the middle. We've got wearable devices like smartwatches and different devices that are collecting data. You have visits to the local physician. Those would be for just any of the biometrics that you need to collect from the physician's office, as well as making sure that you are meeting all the eligibility criteria, labs. All of that information goes into a database. You have drug manufacturer as well as distribution going to the study coordination center. And from there, it all gets spread out in terms of drugs, as well as questions related to the data, maybe even patient quality of life forms that are being completed on a regular basis and submitted electronically by the patient. And it also encapsulates web recruiting, reaching out and trying to find additional participants for your studies using the internet and different algorithms to help isolate the correct population. We saw in a number of different places that it was being reported that, people are starting to enjoy the idea of home medicine, of being able to meet some of the things that they're doing on their own time and on their own soil. Studies like this that were put out in different media format talk a little bit about this idea of decentralizing the clinical trial. What aspects can be moved into this home environment where the patient has a little more control, where they are potentially answering or responding to queries, entering data, for example, e-diaries or quality of life surveys, making sure that they're uploading certain bits of information that's collected through either a wearable device or even camera, if they're taking photos of a lesion, for example, on their hand. All of this can be done at home, assuming that the patient has the right parameters and the right protocol to be able to upload and share their data. It allows us to meet the patients where they are. And in some cases, what we are seeing is that we have a spectrum. So we have those studies that are somewhat fully centralized, meaning every visit requires the patient to be in the clinic or being seen by a physician, for example, in order to be completed, versus those that are fully decentralized, where the patient is using the internet, maybe the phone, to respond to questionnaires and also provide additional information. What we see, though, is that most of these models are using a hybrid, where some portion of it is being done in the clinic and the rest being done at home. And as you can imagine, there are pros and cons for both sides. So in terms of the pros, we're talking about reduced cost. We're talking about a more comfortable patient environment for the patient, especially if they are fairly sick or ill. It's better for them to be able to stay at home and not have to worry about the transportation or travel to a clinical site. In terms of the cons, though, one of the biggest things that people oftentimes say is, well, the data might be missing, or there might not be as much data or as rich data. But what we're finding is that with the right motivation and the right amount of interaction from the site staff or from the study staff, patients do remain engaged. So there is a bit of give and take for this. But for the most part, what we see working the best is the hybrid model, where some of the visits are being done in the clinic and the rest being done at home. In terms of different types of activities that could be considered to be done mostly remote, this survey really looked at what services would be the best or be the most optimized for a virtual environment. Digital site engagement, patient online identification and recruitment, and even trial decentralization to homes or alternative sites, and digital patient engagement and assessment. So those were the main categories that people were asked questions on, and trying to determine how comfortable they were with their data being used at different points. As you can see with the arrows on the left-hand side, it goes from activation to enrollment and study conduct with differing variations of use. For the most part, what we can say from this is that a lot of the activities that we consider as part of recruitment and retention, those things that keep patients in studies and also bring them to studies, are done really well in virtual environment. Things that are not being done as smoothly but have room for improvement are potentially getting new sites up and running and involved into a clinical trial. But that can be changed and augmented with the right training and the right reinforcement to get those sites up and running. As you can see, though, for the most part, electronic data and patient-reported outcomes are very favorable, meaning patients really want to have the opportunity to provide information about themselves and how they're feeling from the comfort of their own home. This has really changed the ecosystem of clinical trials, and just in a very short amount of time, less than a year to a year. And it really changed the way and feel of a lot of clinical trials. In order to keep clinical studies moving forward, they had to meet the demand of being at home and being isolated. And many studies had to pivot and come up with different ways of collecting data, tracking data, and making sure that those who were enrolled in their studies were being engaged and felt as though they were part of the process rather than just receiving cold emails to answer data, for example. So what you see here are a variety of different companies, mostly CROs, that were polled and asked questions about their ecosystem and how they've either expanded or contracted over time, with a wide variety of variation. But most of them agreed that with decentralized clinical trials and the right type of environment, these things could be done and done very well. And the industry has just expanded in a number of ways related to what we've learned during COVID. There's also been reports about Asia Pacific being the next frontier for decentralized clinical trials. There are a lot of areas in Asia that are urban, which are not very difficult for patients to access and become part of clinical trials, but there are equally as many rural areas where it's very difficult to get to a clinical site for some individuals. So it would be nice to be able to expand out to those areas and offer them access to these clinical trials using these same methods, these same decentralized clinical trials. And there's a lot of appeal to making sure that decentralized clinical trials can be done. For example, the population size, as I alluded to just a moment ago, 60% of our global population can be found in Asia, and most of it is at large urban centers with about 2.3 billion people accounted for. Having decentralized clinical trials and ways of connecting with patients and participants in a fashion that is they're accustomed to helps to improve the quality of people going into the studies, as well as the retention of those individuals through the duration of the clinical trial. It also allows for a broader and more diverse set of not only geographies, but also ethnicities. And this is an issue we'll talk about in a little bit, but it gives us access to more communities and more individuals, as well as age groups, that really help to inform the data that we're collecting and make sure that the drugs that we are trying to get tested and medical products that we are trying to get tested really meet the criteria and needs of the populations that they serve. It also helps us understand varying disease patterns, conditions that we see in the Asian Pacific communities also allow us to make some determinations to the global clinical research programs that are also serving people of Asian descent. Technology has changed, and it has changed in very good and unique ways. It allows us to embrace innovation, incorporate it, and grow with it as we maneuver our studies through their environments. Having DCT allows us to do wonderful things like electronic data capture, electronic medical records, review, monitoring, and a variety of other labor-intensive activities that are now able to be done from the comfort of one's home. The biggest thing, though, that is impacting DCTs in the Asian environment is the fact that Asia is the fastest growing global market for pharmaceutical sales and will continue to rise. With that rise, we need to have better access and more sustainable ways of being able to reach patients and populations. Here's a white paper that was also recently published that talked a little bit about how China was embracing decentralized clinical trial solutions. Within this survey that was conducted looking at patient information, sponsors of clinical trials, and clinical research organizations, all of them reported in some way being able to see the benefits of both virtual and hybrid clinical trials. There was some concern related to regulatory gaps, digital data collection, logistics, the general things that we hear most when we talk about this type of environment. But with the right harmonization and the right practice, it's very easy to make sure that those gaps are very, very small and don't pose any problems for the future. In terms of decentralized clinical trial acceptance, at least the concept of it, this is some data that was captured from a survey of just under 700 respondents from West China Hospital. Most of the people who were polled in this study were very acceptable of this idea of decentralized clinical trials, which points to the fact that it is a growing area and will continue to be a growing area where we can actually have a foothold, where we can gain some traction and hopefully engage with our participants and patients in a more meaningful way. It will help with enrollment, it will help with recruitment as well as retention. Additionally, from this study, additional data was asked, looking at how acceptable different elements of decentralized clinical trials were. And as you can see, it's a wide variety of acceptance across different aspects of clinical data collection, including things like dictionaries, e-diaries and questionnaires, as well as wearable devices, being able to participate via video, having direct deliveries of medical products to their home, and even using informed consent tools that are electronic to be able to enroll into clinical trials. Very favorable across the board, and I think that we will see these numbers become even more positive as time goes forward and we have more experience doing decentralized clinical trials across the board. Artificial intelligence is a rapidly growing area in terms of clinical trial design and development. Within it, it's really starting to transform how we engage and how we envision and how we proceed with clinical trials. If you think about it very broadly, artificial intelligence can be used to help us generate preclinical data. We can look for the potentially best product or best compound to use in certain conditions. We can model it in silico or in the computer system, looking for variations or areas of risk or benefit that we could exploit or use to help us move the study forward into at least animal models and cell models before taking it to human models. Having this type of engagement allows us to really expand on the development of these potential compounds. The nice thing with it, it also gives us a little more area to work within in terms of risk and benefit. We can model some of the potential risks ahead of time so that we are well prepared and really look more closely at some of the compounds that we have in the pipeline. In terms of where this type of development from AI will have the most impact, it will probably be between the research and discovery as well as clinical development areas within clinical trials that will have the most substantial impact. If we think of it from the clinical development standpoint, it can help with a variety of different algorithms to really help us identify both safety and efficacy early on through some unique data points. It can also help us really understand how we can make it a much easier and better process to get drugs approved. As you probably know, less than 10% of all candidates that start the process of clinical trials actually end up becoming approved through the regulatory process as a medical product at the end of the day. Having the ability to look at these different phases of studies, the data that we're collecting, and project different risk patterns will be very valuable in the future. So in terms of what this would look like, oh, sorry, clicked on the wrong thing there. If we think about this from the patient's perspective, AI will really enable us to be able to navigate through clinical trials in a much more predictable and effective way. It really will help us move into this truly patient-centric area where we really are focused on the patient. It will help us provide data as we go that is meaningful for the participant, and it will also help analyze data along the way to make sure that safety is at the utmost concern of the clinical trial. It allows us to do it in real time and with much better efficacy. So as you can see from this model, if you have a positive diagnosis and potentially available treatments that are currently on the market are not effective, you can use the AI system to really help search through different clinical trials that exist, maybe even using the patient's clinical data as filters for specific ongoing studies and upcoming studies. You can quickly mine a lot of the data that's available, maybe match an individual to a phase 2 or phase 3 study that they could then proceed and go enroll in. They could get monthly or even weekly support from their mobile device, talking to them about different aspects of their disease, about their upcoming studies, could even host different forms of frequently asked questions so the patient can look through a library of documented questions and find answers. Using their mobile devices and wearables, they can have constant monitoring that will send information to not only their clinical team, their medical care team, but also could be used in a way to help generate potentially new clinical studies, or at least point them in the direction of clinical studies that they may be available to. Virtual monitoring and telemedicine can also reduce site visits. It can reduce some of the anxiety that patients feel upon going to the clinic. And it can also help support them where they are able to feel the most comfortable, whether that's at home, maybe outside in the park, wherever they are accessing their devices and getting information. They're doing it on their own terms and at their own leisure. If sites are required, it would be good to have an AI platform that could tell you of additional sites that may be closer to the patient where they could go, for example, to get their blood drawn, or could go and have their blood pressure checked. Maybe they don't have to take that hour-long bus ride to get to the central clinic, but they could go to one of the auxiliary clinics that are maybe only 3 or 4 city blocks from where they are currently. All of this could be enabled through AI. So in the US, we have been on a long journey, and our students who do research with us in our program, this is something that is very near and dear to their hearts. They all deal with this idea of clinical trial diversity in different ways as they are doing their research with us. In the US, we have different populations that are oftentimes and very classically listed as underrepresented. And that's because they are not necessarily always enrolled or recruited for in terms of clinical trials. So as you can see on the left-hand side, we have our general population in terms of ethnic breakdown. And on the right-hand side, we have clinical trial participants. As you can see, it's very drastically different in terms of who we are enrolling into clinical trials. And unfortunately, what that does is it tells us that a lot of the medications that we have been testing, a lot of the medical products that we've been testing are good for certain individuals. And in this case, it would be Caucasian or white individuals who represent the bulk of our clinical trial participants. Diversity in clinical trials really is there to benefit everyone. In the US, there has been some speculation that by 2040, the minority groups will become the majority. And without inclusive data, we will truly and honestly risk the future of medicine for everyone. If we are only testing our drugs on old, middle-aged white men from the suburbs, that is all we can really say about the efficacy and safety of our drugs, is that they work in that population. Because of this idea, the FDA has really been pushing for us to make sure that we are representing and getting more representation in our clinical trials. They've even stated that participants in clinical trials should represent the patients that will use the medical products. Diversity is a concern because people of different ages, races, and ethnicities oftentimes will react differently to medical products. There could be cultural differences, there could be differences in age or even forgetfulness as we get older that could be impacted and would really be beneficial for us to understand if we had the right diversity. In terms of diversity in Asia and building that diversity into clinical trials, it can be a little difficult to build diversity into the clinical trials in Asia. However, with the right amount of planning and good partnerships, it would be pretty feasible and easy to help meet the needs of these diversity requirements, both for studies that were being conducted in the US and also studies that were being conducted in Asia Pacific. Real-world data and real-world evidence, oftentimes you'll hear them called the same thing. And just to give you an idea of what that looks like, we have two pictures here. So we have the controlled setting and the real world. And I think this image really sums up what real-world data is. In clinical trials, we control a lot of the variables. We control the patients that we enroll through the eligibility criteria, and we monitor those eligibility criteria very closely. When drugs move from the clinical trial environment into the market or the real world, a lot of variability happens. Different individuals are taking these drugs, different people who are not necessarily the standard people who were in our eligibility criteria in our phase 3 are accessing these drugs and using them. And that means that along the way, we get different reports, we get different outcomes for individuals, and all of that data gets collected and used to help us understand how we can make these drugs better when we move them to the real world environment. So as this data gets collected, the question might arise, when would we use this real world evidence or real world data? And how would we use it, or why would we use it? In terms of new product approvals, medical products, you may want to use the data that you have observed to really help either accelerate the approval of a product that you're working on based off of a surrogate endpoint that you've identified through the process of looking at the real world data. In terms of label expansion or revisions to existing products on the market, having real world data may give you new indications or even new populations that the drug works for or doesn't work for. It can help you really tune into things like dosing and administration of the drug, maybe even safety profiles, as well as looking at efficacy across different indications, for example, or even within populations. Post-marketing commitments and requirements. Oftentimes, the routine use of this real-world data helps us to improve the safety of the drugs through monitoring and surveillance of the reports that we are getting from people using these products in the real world. And in some cases can even lead to confirmatory studies where we are looking to make sure that what we see in a small subset of the population either is or is not a problem for safety and efficacy. If we think about how we would use real-world data, what we have here in this graph, the dotted line is randomized clinical trials, and the solid line represents real-world evidence. From the development all the way through to the mature phase of the study, so that would be from phase 1 or 0 all the way up to phase 3. As you can see, the real-world data really pairs in nicely to give us kind of a better look at the types of people that we would want to engage in the types of situations that it might best benefit specific drug classes. Now, it's not going to help for products that are new to the market or maybe don't have additional classes behind them, but it will help us understand how a drug within a class may work or may function, especially in the earlier phases. As we get more refined data, it helps us understand what the safety and efficacy profile would look like in a much broader population. And this data really gives us a lot of insight, especially if we're developing a drug that might be second or third line therapy based on some other drugs who have gone before us within the same class. And we have a very similar safety profile, very similar drug profile. It may help us to look at this real world data to look for different nuances that we could anticipate happening through our phase 2 and phase 3 studies. With real-world data sources, it can help us meet needs in a variety of ways. It can help us really identify unmet needs, and that could be things like comorbidities or even burden of disease. And it can also help us inform clinical and policy decisions that we tend to make based off of the data we've collected. And that could include things like pharmacovigilance, even population level impacts for specific groups of individuals. It can help us understand benefit and risk for specific subgroups, and can oftentimes lead to new indications. The sources of data that we get for real world information come to us from a variety of different areas, everything from claims data, which would be insurance claims, cost data, all the way through to social media. All of it can help inform the ways people are interacting with, taking, and experiencing the medical products that we have on the market. In terms of the overall timeline of clinical studies, real-world evidence can come into our studies earlier and earlier to help give us kind of a look into the pre-discovery drug discovery phase, maybe through enlightening us to new disease mechanisms, or even enhancing our understanding of the natural history of a disease, which would help us inform the upfront process of looking for and developing these products. It can work with us in the post-marketing or the evaluation phase, the phase 4 studies, by looking at usage patterns and trying to understand how patients are using a drug, for example, if it's very expensive and it's not covered by their insurance in a way that would be useful for them. It can help us then understand what happens if people are only taking, let's say, half of the recommended dosage and what that looks like in those individuals. And those are just a few examples. There are many, many more ways that you can use this data to really understand the products that you're developing and putting into the market. A few examples of how this works. We have here a couple of very popular drugs. We have Sudafed and Flonase, as well as aspirin. And what we're looking at are specific reports of different things that are happening. So for example, with the Sudafed, we're looking for the reports of people with blurred vision. And as you can see, we have a number of reports, a lot of them spiking around 2010 and 2012, and then tapering down a little bit. What this can tell us is that based on the information related to the blurred vision, we might be able to come up with a more sustainable way of using these drugs or recommending that these drugs get used. And you can see this across the board. The sedation in aspirin, starting in 2011, for example, with 53 reports, tapering down to as low as 15 within 2013, but then spiking again in 2019. By looking at the way these reports are being submitted and the data that surrounds the reports, we can begin to build a picture of how that sedation is happening, or the conditions in which the sedation is happening, which will allow us to then better inform people about potential risks and benefits of these products. It creates a really good mechanism for us to be able to sustain a lot of the products that we use on a regular basis, and many of them over the counter. Mobile health. So we've touched on this a little bit throughout the talk today, but mobile health really is going to help empower not only clinical health, but also clinical trial participation in a number of ways, mostly through gathering and analyzing data. It can help us build things like preventive care strategies in the clinic, but it can also help us track compliance and look at different strategies by measuring vital signs for patients who are in clinical trials. To get this information into a meaningful way will require us to really build out health informatics and make sure that we have professionals with understanding in health informatics to really ensure that the data that we're collecting on these devices is both reliable and useful, not only for the patients, but also for the needs of the clinical trial or the needs of their clinical care. The types of data can vary. It could be anything that would help with the patient's care or even help with specific elements of the clinical trial. It could help, for example, for people with high-risk heart disease by looking at their blood pressure at specific intervals or their heart rate and transmitting that directly to their physician. In real time, you can monitor that person's health. With diabetes, for example, you could have them either manually input their blood sugar numbers and then upload that to the physician, or if you had a device that could electronically send that information directly without the risk of the manual typing of the individual, who may or may not always be very accurate, it will help improve the way that their diabetes are being monitored. It allows us to track a lot of elements, everything from posture to daily activity, walking, heart rate, oxygen saturation. A lot of this can be used in ways to help with our overall wellness and lifestyle goals, but also help us with clinical information that is valuable for our studies. In terms of preventive strategies, it can help us understand how changes in medication, changes in diet or exercise can help prevent things like heart attack and stroke. For the elderly patients, it can be useful to help prevent falls or prevent major accidents from occurring from a fall. And the data can be then used remotely through remote data capture. The predominant way that we use remote data capture today is through electronic case report forms. We also rely a little bit on wearable device data, but for the most part, ECRFs tend to be the way that we are getting the bulk of information electronically for our clinical trials. The benefits of having electronic records are innumerable. Mostly, you have timely access to your data. You can look at different trends very quickly. It improves patient safety. There's also ways that you can filter and look at different combinations of, for example, biochemistry markers to assess a person's health in new and unique ways. I don't know about your penmanship, but mine on a good day can be pretty bad. So having someone read my penmanship can be a little daunting, but in an electronic format, the data removes that penmanship error or the potential for penmanship errors and makes it very clear and concise. It helps to manage knowledge bases, not only of the medical care team, but also of the patient by suggesting different things that could be discussed during key intervals or key appointments with patients. It can help us minimize adverse drug effects by making sure that we have access to what the individual is taking, how they're using it. Over time, there will be decreases in costs for sure. And as we become better with these systems, patient notification and interaction will also improve. There are a lot of benefits to using electronic case report forms. Not only is the data collection faster and also more reliable, but when you have a large volume of data, if you have a site that is enrolling thousands of patients, you have that data access a lot quicker, and it can allow for statisticians and people in the study to do some really unique evaluations early on to make sure that you are getting the right kinds of data that you need. ECRs also help reduce data losses. Not only are these things being backed up and they are being supported through electronic mechanisms to protect them, you don't have to worry about paper case report forms being lost before they're even entered, especially if it's done simultaneously with either an iPad device, iPad-like device, or a computer right in clinic or in the patient's home. It reduces errors and also costs. So doing dual data entry, which is the preferred method of making sure that data entry is being done correctly for clinical trials where one person enters it and another person verifies it, is costly, and you can cut down on those costs, making it a much more sustainable model. ECRS also allow for data to be shared remotely across different stakeholders in research, as well as in clinical care. So if you have a finding that is significant, that would impact a patient's health, you can share that directly with their clinical team and make sure that it's being monitored and managed. It also facilitates data capture in a way that is real time, but also rapid, and also allows for data management to occur in real time and rapidly, making sure that any errors or discrepancies are addressed and removed or updated immediately. It also gives us really easy and transparent access in terms of dashboards and looking at data to the data that is most important for a clinical trial. And you can have that access at all times during the course of a study. We can't talk about data collection or data management without really talking a little bit about monitoring. They kind of go hand in hand. Remote monitoring, though, is a new and exciting world that we have started to embark into. If we think about monitoring just as the standard models go, many of us are probably familiar with the central monitoring model or the offsite monitoring model. And if none of those are ringing a bell, you are definitely familiar with the on-site monitoring. This is kind of the tried and true standard model that we used to follow and cling to very religiously, where you send someone to a clinical site to do verification of the data that's been entered, make sure that the personnel are trained and fully prepared to execute a clinical trial. It's a lot of time spent on the ground at a site doing these activities. Some monitors are there usually a week, sometimes 2 weeks, depending on the site and the volume of patients. So that's a huge cost, paying to have that individual stay in a city that isn't their own usually. Flight, travel, hotel, food, it becomes very expensive. If you can reduce that by using either offsite monitoring or central monitoring, where specific pieces of data are requested to be sent in for review, it can help to reduce those costs. But virtual site monitoring, which became very prevalent during COVID, taught us a few things, that we can do the same level of monitoring and do it very well. We just have to change the parameters and change what we're looking at for it to work and work in a way that is meaningful. But we can still do it in a way that provides the same level of quality and assurance across the board. As you can imagine, the cost that the clinical trials incur increases as the monitoring becomes more intense. And what I mean by that is the more person hours spent on site looking for specific anomalies increases the cost to the trial. When we reduce those costs, we have the ability to divert those funds into other areas like recruitment or retention, which helps to reach our enrollment numbers a lot quicker and allows us to move the study forward at a quicker pace. So that was kind of quick and dirty look at how we have different elements within our current clinical trial process that we can use and harness for sustainability, as well as making sure that we are able to meet our patients and participants where they're the most comfortable. With that, we have a few moments left. I would like to bring back Dr. Pacifici, and together we are happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thank you. Thank you so much for a fascinating presentation or lecture, I'd call. Dr. Church shared so many insights from various aspects on how to move towards sustainability in terms of clinical trials and decentralized medical process and et cetera. I'm not a professional in this area, but I got very concentrated in this during the process. So I think that was valuable, and we received not a lot of questions, but I do have I do have a few questions for you as well. So let's start with the question that we received from other platform. Someone says, to me, clinical trials is more like lab work. What is the work routine for being a regulatory science professional, or the process of, or a daily routine, I'd say? Yeah.
Well, there's a lot of variability. So if you like puzzles, and this is what I tell anyone who's interested in learning a little bit about regulatory, if you like puzzles, this is the perfect field for you, because each day will be different. You're working on different aspects of trying to get a study moved through the process, to get approval, to even launch. You're working with vendors, trying to get them up and running. You're working with people internally on different teams to move projects from phase 1 all the way through to the market. You're working on applications that you're sending to regulatory agencies. You're responding to questions that you've received from other products that you're working on. So it's a pretty full day, but like I said, it's a lot of puzzles, a lot of things that you have to kind of tease out and work your way around. So it's a very variable day. It's not necessarily a lab-based day. You could have those if you wanted to, depending on what area of regulatory you were in, specifically quality assurance in that case. But the real regulatory work is cerebral. I'll say that.
Yes, I think when we talk about clinical trials, we are really talking about testing a new product or a new use for an existing product in humans. And so when you work in a laboratory and you work with test tubes, or you work with cells, or you work with animals, everything is done right there in the lab. However, when you talk about working with human volunteers in clinical trials, they're not all in one room. So if you were to conduct a clinical trial that requires 200 patients, for example, you are going to have those patients in multiple cities. And so that makes conducting clinical trials logistically very challenging. And in terms of carbon footprint, it can be quite significant. So, you have, in order to conduct one clinical trial, which essentially is one experiment, you end up spending a lot of time and effort to conduct a trial across multiple cities, sometimes multiple countries, and then making sure that the trial is being conducted properly, and then collect all the data. And so regulatory professionals, most times in these situations, are involved in making sure all the data is properly collected, and then making sure that that information is properly compiled into reports, and that that information is then communicated to regulatory agencies of the countries where you want to market the product. So you can see how to conduct one experiment, which if you were a laboratory scientist, you can start in the morning and finish by the afternoon. In case of clinical trials, you can start in the morning and finish 3 years later.
Yeah.
And so that is why conducting clinical trials is the part of product development that takes the most amount of energy, costs the most amount of money, and takes the longest time. And so when Dr. Church talks about decentralized trials, he talks about mobile apps, he talks about real-world data for real-world evidence. That all, hopefully, if the technology becomes mature and the adoption becomes fully implemented, then we will see the cost going down, the time contracting, and the effort lessening, and more importantly, we can reduce the carbon footprint and make the data more relevant to real world scenarios.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much. So to students' concern, of course, they want to know that while they, during their study in the regulatory sciences major, or after they enter the department, well, researches or the clinical trials, like what you mentioned, those process, well, those scientific process be involved during their study.
Maybe I can start with that. Yes, there are a couple different ways. One is you will learn about the management of clinical trials and the design and statistical approaches for clinical trials. In fact, Dr. Church is one of the co-instructors for the clinical trial course, and he has a long history of actually being involved in conducting clinical trials. So you'll be in experts' hands in terms of learning from the people who really have in-depth experience. I myself have conducted clinical trials as well. So, clinical trial is one of the big areas that our students can go into. You can, during your program, during your time with us, become an intern in the clinical trial field. So, that's definitely an option. One of the things that I think for our students, there are so many options for them to do. When you learn and you have a degree in regulatory and quality sciences, you can apply your learnings in the clinical trial field and become a clinical trial expert. You can be a quality science expert and work in the quality control and quality assurance arena. That's really helpful if somebody is good in the lab and they want to continue working on assay development and understand how drugs are tested. You can work in regulatory affairs arena, which is where you are the interface between the company and the regulatory agencies around the world. So I guess, yes, when you come to our program, we will prepare you to enter the field of your choosing within this regulated industry. However, before you come to us, one of the areas that will be really helpful is not only a good scientific background in life sciences, but also you need to really be proficient in communication skills. As Dr. Church described, the world is becoming truly complex. You have data analytics, you have artificial intelligence, you have complicated legal and regulatory pathways. And so you really, when Dr. Church says, you have to be a puzzle solver and you have to be very cerebral, it takes a lot of thinking, a critical thinking, in order to do this job well. So in preparation for coming into our program, I would urge your audience to work really hard and brush up on all your life science skills, but then also practice critical thinking and critical writing. So writing where you can take complex material and combine it and digest it, and then be able to write in a very clear and well-constructed manner. That is a critical part of the job of a regulatory professional.
One of the things I really
Yes.
love about our program is that it's practical application. So it's not just theory that you're learning. You are actually doing some of these things in the classroom setting where it's a safe space where you can practice and learn the skills that you need to help you when you go out into the real world. And I think that's one of the most valuable aspects of our program, is that we help the students get the skills that they need and the confidence as well to be able to apply what they've learned in the classroom in a variety of ways throughout their career.
Clear enough. Thank you so much. Okay, next question. Someone says, hi, Professor. At the first stage of the beginning, you showed us mobile health, also AI product developed in medical industry. Could you explain more what we can do about this? I think that relates to something I'd like to ask as well. What's the relationship between technology and medicine after all the information that we received? Yeah.
So I think the easiest way is to start with your question, because that's kind of the more straightforward one. There's been a very positive relationship between technology and medicine from its inception all the way forward. And as we've entered into this digital age, information is coming at us a lot faster. It's being incorporated a lot smoother and easier. And it's really advancing what we're doing at a monumental rate. If you think about it, just 10 years ago, some of the things that we're talking about today seemed like they were science fiction and not even on the horizon to be done. And now we have a lot of really good application of these different areas, especially AI. And I can see it becoming more and more prevalent. Think about having an anatomy class where it's all virtual, where you go into the virtual environment and you are doing your anatomy classes on a virtual person. That cuts down on cadaver costs, but it also makes it very easy and accessible anywhere that has a device that you can wear to plug in. So if you're studying for exams, what a great way to do it if you can do it virtually. Now, that's not going to replace the idea of dissecting something or having that tactile sensation, but it will give you the ability to learn in new ways. And that's just one application, but it can be applied in so many ways going forward. And I think the unique part for our environment is that it will help us speed up clinical trials and make them a lot safer and a lot more effective in terms of who we are reaching and how we're reaching them.
So, and I'm not wearing one right now, but I have an Apple Watch.
Mhm.
And so that's a mobile health.
Yeah.
So my Apple Watch, and I'm sure many in your audience also wears a smartwatch. My Apple Watch can measure my heart rate, right?
Mm.
So, and it can measure my pulse oximetry, so my blood oxygen level. It can also measure my EKG. Now, it is right now not really regulated by the FDA because it gives me information, but it doesn't tell me if I have a medical condition. But you can imagine that connection could be done very quickly, right? And so you could have an artificial intelligence that goes through the data that is being collected, because millions of data points are now being collected through my Apple Watch. It will know if you apply artificial intelligence. It will be able to know how I am feeling, how I sleep, if I am dehydrated, if I am overexerting myself, if I have sleep apnea, if I have arrhythmia. And at some point, that artificial intelligence can tell me, go drink some water, or take your medicine, or turn over onto your side when you are sleeping. And so that's when you can have artificial intelligence and mobile health come together. And we're not there yet, but you can imagine how that could in the future, change the way we live.
Yeah. Fascinating. Yes, true. Sometimes I got terrified when my watch does something that I don't even notice. That's a little horrifying, but I guess we'll get better.
Sometimes you have to
Um,
change the settings so it doesn't bully you, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes it'll say, you haven't moved in 20 minutes, get up.
Oh God.
But
Yes.
I mean, it's only terrifying until you start to rely on it, right?
Oh yeah.
And
Yes.
you start to
True.
see benefit. So
Yes.
my new car has kind of a lane assist and also parking assist. And it doesn't really, it's not an auto navigating car. It's not self-driving car, but it has this camera that it constructs. It has cameras all over the car. So now when I'm parking, it shows me the bird's eye view of my car. And immediately I became I completely became used to that. Now I can't live without it.
It's a good function.
Now I know how the car is exactly in its parking spot. And so all of a sudden, something I never had before, that I was kind of horrified when I first saw it. And now I can't live without it. And that's how, human mind, the nature of human, we're very adaptable.
Makes sense. Yeah. Couldn't agree more. Okay, let's move on to the next question. Someone asks if I'm not in a life science life science background, but in business, will that be a barrier for me to apply to this program? We
Well,
get that a lot, right?
well, you know what? It depends. I mean, sometimes I have undergrad students who are business administration majors, but they're taking science courses. So if you are a business student, but you have taken science courses, we would take that into account. A GRE would be helpful in cases where you feel like you want to demonstrate your strength as a student. And in those cases, even though we do not require GREs, sometimes when the students feel like they want to show their academic capabilities, then you can go ahead and take the GRE and demonstrate that you have the potential to perform well in our program. Our program is quite rigorous. It because the work that we do is really important. You know, when we have students who go out to the industry after they graduate and they are working on, you know, important drugs or, you know, devices that could potentially be used by patients all over the world. That's serious business. And so our program is very rigorous, so we can, you know, prepare our students to go work in the industry or go work in the FDA. But so what we are looking for when we are assessing the applications is to see if they can successfully complete our program. So, you know, it will not do anybody any favors by bringing in people who cannot finish the program successfully. So it's really important that we carefully consider the applicants, and the applicants carefully consider the program so that they can come and be successful. Because the ones who do successfully graduate from our program, they are highly sought after because of the fact that the regulated field has currently really a high demand and a low supply of graduates who can enter this field.
Thank you. Thank you for your explanation. We'll answer Lan Huang's question from Zoom. This viewer direct messaged me and asking the similar question, saying without biomedical science or medical undergraduate background, what's the effects or factor that will affect
Oh no. No, I think the question was, will that be a factor that affects success? And what I would say is that in this area, it's definitely good to have some science background. You don't have to be engaged fully in pre-med, for example, or pre-pharmacy, but you have to have a working understanding of science, and that could be basic science or human anatomy. Ideally, both, but we'll take one if we have it. But yes, you should have a little bit of science in your background.
Looks like Jill's have some problem with her maybe the Zoom. There's another question there, I think.
So the question is, thanks for the speech, really helpful. I'm a graduate student from USC and MPA major. I really want to apply to this major. Do you have any recommendation to get a chance to do so? Definitely. Our application process has been streamlined. We've changed it a little bit over the years. So we have the ability to get a little more information about our students. There's a little bit of a writing sample that you have to provide that tells us a little bit about who you are as a researcher. And the application itself is open to you. So I would say, please apply. If you have questions while you're completing the application, you can reach out to any one of us. We're happy to guide you to Desiree, who is in our department. She's our staff member who kind of keeps us all in line when it comes to getting graduate students into the program. And she's a real guru at navigating students through different aspects of their application. So we can put you in touch with her and she can help guide you through that process.
What's an MPA?
MPA, Master of Public Policy, Public Administration. Yep. So there's 5 schools, yeah.
Oh, you know what? Actually, that's an interesting background, because regulations and policy are related. So we have law, we have regulation, we have policy, and then we have guidance. So that would be a background with the public administration will kind of give you a different insight when you join our program. So what I've done here is I have in the chat box put our department website, and then I will also and if you scroll down, you have the master's in regulatory science, and I'll go ahead and put that also in the chat, and that's how you will go ahead and apply.
Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Sorry, I got logged out.
Welcome back.
Good that you're back.
Thank you, Terrence. Okay, so everybody heard what my last question, right?
We made it work.
Oh, okay, glad to hear that. Okay, there's another question here popping up. Someone says, thank you. Lee Ron asks, do you offer prerequisites if I want to lean the courses you mentioned?
So that's a great question.
Yeah, maybe Terry and Terrence, you guys can talk about the pre-masters potential.
Definitely. So we've developed a way for students who don't have as strong of a science background as we're looking for or as they feel necessary, where you can get some of those skills through taking our undergraduate courses while you're part of the learning program that we offer for students who are coming in to the university. So it's a great way for you to get a little hands-on training with faculty that you will be learning from in the graduate program, as well as getting some of that science background that you are looking for to really help you understand the concepts that you will be learning in the master's program for sure. And it parallels with, I don't know, Terrence, if you want to talk a little bit about it, it parallels with language and enculturation a little bit to get you set up to be a good student in Los Angeles.
Yeah, so when your backgrounds is just, on top of Terry just mentioned that when your background's not quite completely fit into the prerequisite that you mentioned, that certain science backgrounds you don't have, that we do have a program called pre-master program, which coherent when you study your pre-master, you're able to take some about up to 3 of those prerequisite courses. 2 or 3 depends on your levels, that you can take up some courses, make up for the prerequisite or some deficit that you hasn't been able to do when under your undergrad degree, just Terrence mentioned. So yes, we have been able to offer you with, even you may not meet the prerequisite, we do have a program to fit into your we have a program to be in for your demands. So you're welcome to apply. So for any questions, always welcome to contact us. We can explain a little bit more in detail and how you're able to apply through the program, through the pre-master program to the regulatory science majors.
And in those cases, a GRE would really also be helpful for us to assess your potential to be successful in our program. So, if your background does not really, look like it matches what we might require, having a GRE will help.
Hope we answer your question, but do contact us if you have a further discussion on those.
Please contact us through USC China office. That's the WeChat that you can reach out to us to know more about this program and more information. At last, is there anything you'd like to say to our audience, Dr. Pacifici and Dr. Church? Absolutely.
It's always a pleasure to be with you and share kind of some of the current topics that are of interest with all of your audience. It might be helpful if you have some questions or you have some curiosity about this field. because, you know, Dr. Church and I always love to kind of share our perspectives on various topics, but we have so many topics that we can share with you. So if I could get some feedback from the audience about what they would like to hear next, Dr. Terry Church and I can prepare something that would be of interest to your audience for next time.
Definitely. And just thank you so much for all the support that you've given us and allowing us to do this. You make it so seamless for us every time. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Appreciate the words. And thank you everyone for joining us today. Thank you for your time. And until next time, bye.
See you.
Bye, 再见.
Have a good night.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye, bye everyone. Good night.
Bye.
Bye, Terry. Nice to work